Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Elisa Brilli. As you might notice, I'm not Luca Somigli, but he gave me the task to moderate and to introduce today's lecture. So welcome to this new Goggio lecture and second appointment with Jane Tylus, who is Goggio visiting professorship this term and next term here at the University of Toronto. So to begin with, I would like to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years. As we know, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are extremely grateful to be able to work here and also to welcome external guests to our university and land. I know that you already know Jane in general and from last lectures. So my remarks today, my introductory remarks will be shorter than what Laura did last time, just for the sake of the people who are joining us for the first time. So Professor Jane Tylus is Andrew Doni Ulrich Professor in Italian and Professor of Comparative Literature and Divinity at Yale University. Her interest range and spans from different subjects, including women's writing, perhaps the first interest and the first love, with a specific focus on late medieval and early modern women writers. And through these readings and also through the subsequent lives of these authors in contemporary literature, she touched upon a number of different themes, including vulnerability, companionship, translation, which is also another form of companionship, being also a translator on her own, and more recently the theme on which she is presenting here at the University of Toronto, so farewell, and how somehow live together and how to also put a stop to a long-lasting relationship. Among her publications, I would like to remember her first book, Writing and Vulnerability in Late Renaissance, 1993, but also Reclaiming Catherine of Siena, Siena, City of Secrets, and more recently, a forthcoming book on who owns literatures, early modernities, orphan text. So today, Professor Tylus is going to present another part of this long journey through the question of women writings and farewell, and particularly one about Lucrezia Tornabuoni de Medici. So, welcome, Jane.
Grazie, Lisa. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Lisa, and thanks to all of you who have been available this week to meet and to chat. It's been really a pleasure hanging around the second floor downstairs and seeing students, seeing colleagues, talking about common interests and exploring some new ones. And I think for those of you who were here last week, you'll see some continuity. I hope with last week's conversation, there'll also be a bit of a shift today to be talking, not so much about everything from Dante all the way through Elena Ferrante. I'll be a little more focused in early modernity, precisely the period in which this particular painting was done, that is to say the 1470s in Florence. But toward the end, I'll also make a little bridge to a more contemporary moment when I'll say a few words about another woman I've translated, one who is still with us, Dacia Maraini. So I'll be speaking about her towards the end. So this painting, which I'm sure anyone want to take, who knows who painted this? Has at least... It's Tobias and Raphael, absolutely. And
like a Florentine.
No, exactly. And who's the painter? He did one of these, but this isn't his. There's actually two painters in this one. There's the painter who did most of it, and then there's the young apprentice who did this dog. Let me give you a close-up of the dog. Anyone recognize whose hand? No? Close. I mean, Leonardo da Vinci was working with Verrocchio. Andrea del Verrocchio was the painter of most of the painting. and Leonardo da Vinci was his apprentice at the time. And it's thought that this wonderful little fluffy dog, who's just adorable, and who follows Tobias on the road all the way to Medea and back, was the 16, 17-year-old something apprentice who helped Verrocchio. Well, Ken Burns is good about this. Yes.
2 nights ago on PBS.
That's great. Okay, we'll follow up on that later. That's wonderful. So just to take us back to the whole thing, you can look at it for another second or so. And absolutely right. This is a painting of the biblical figure of the young Tobias, not the old one, but the young one, and Raphael. As again, I'm sure many of you know, his father, the older Tobias padre, goes blind because of his overextending works of charity. He becomes poor. He's in desperate need of money, so he's asking his son to help him by going to a relative to whom he had lent money some time ago in the effort to get it back. So here we see the young boy Tobias with the angel Raphael, although Tobias doesn't realize this guy's an angel, even though, of course, he has wings, but we're not supposed to notice that. As they're taking a trip to unknown lands to get money back and restore Tobias's well-being. So the tantalizing presence of Leonardo's hand aside, I want to say today that the painting is of interest for me for at least another reason. As I said a second ago, it's the product of Florence in the late Quattrocento, the 1470s. And so it shares a date with at least 2 literary works which were dedicated to the Book of Tobias in a time of heightened interest in the story. One, an anonymous, or until quite recently, an anonymous Sacra Representazione, or sacred play. And secondly, the Vita di Tubia, which is a poem in terza rima by this lady, Lucrezia Tornabuoni de Medici, who, along with her poetic versions of the books of Esther and Judith and a story about San Giovanni Battista, was really one of the great women writers of the 15th century. That is to say, all of her works, until quite recently, were left in manuscript. They've only been published in Italy since the 1970s. So again, as well known as her works may have been in her lifetime, they were not published until the late 20th century. But it's a single ottavo from the play called La Festa dell'Agnolo Raffaello e di Tobia that offers me an especially appropriate entry point for thinking about Tornabuoni and thinking about Tobias. At this part of the play, the young boy Tobias really wants to help his dad and go on this long trip to get the money back, but he's very nervous about going by himself. His father urges him to find someone to go with him. And lo and behold, an angel disguised as a noble youth, courteous and wise, appears in the piazza. Young Tobias returns to his father with this news. Dear father, I found a man out there, a noble youth, both courteous and wise, cortese saggio. He seems to have been born in paradise. He's compassionate and he knows all the roads. He seems well-traveled right throughout the world. He knows the language of every place. Di tutte le nazioni sa lor linguaggio. And he's explored the world from east to west, il ponente e levante, and all of his words seem full of holiness. Now the stanza riffs considerably on the much less colorful phrase in the Latin Vulgate on which it's based, in which a single sentence reports on the encounter, basically, Dad, I met someone, in the square. Raphael's own account of himself is also more inflated in the play. While in the Vulgate he says only that he has traveled to Media, the playwright has him traveling the entire world. And moreover, as I've obviously highlighted, he knows the languages of every nation. And so he's the perfect translator. Hence, perhaps, Raphael's primacy in Lucrezia Tornabuoni's invocation to her Vita di Tubia. O glorioso eterno magno Dio, deporgi aiuto al mio nuovo disio. Signore, se mai usati caritade verso d'alcun che ti preghi umilmente, che hai avuti la sua buona volontade, grazie ti chiedo, Signor mio clemente, che possa la storietta di Tobia, the little tale of Tobias, mettere in versi e piaccia tutta gente. And to continue, here's where Raphael comes in. O tu mi manda in guardia e compagnia, Raphael, che mandasti accompagnare l'unico figlio all'incognito via, il qual lo seppe in maniera guardare, che egli andò e tornò a salvamento. Rather than just aiding Tobias, Raphael is presented here as a guide or companion to Tornabuoni herself. Her journey as a translator, that is to say, parallels that of the young boy. And in that parallel, I'll suggest, we might discover a productive way to think about early modern translation and its resonance for more contemporary approaches. Several decades ago, the Brazilian poet and amazing translator into Portuguese from the Greek and Latin and other languages, Haroldo de Campos, responded to Walter Benjamin's provocative declaration, "There is no muse of translation," with a provocation of his own. If translation has no muse, one could say that it has an angel. De Campos's angel, however, is not the trustworthy Raphael, but the edgy Lucifer, who, far from being faithful to God, flagrantly disobeyed him. Resistant to concepts of translational fidelity, De Campos argues that translation should refuse to, quote, submit to the tyranny of a preordained logos. Yet De Campos's characterization of Lucifer becomes less diabolical as he proceeds in his own article. While the translator may not feel responsible to the preordained in any absolute sense, he is sensitive to a text's longing to migrate from one language to another. That longing can only be fulfilled, the rescue ensured, by going over the configurative road of the poetic function again, recognizing it in the source text and reinserting it as a device for textual engendering and growth. The translator, that is not so much an infernal angel as a benevolent traveler who follows the same road as the poem. If De Campos sees himself as the rescuing angel, Tornabuoni sees her own role on the road as one enacted in the company of another, perhaps someone attuned to words that are longing to migrate. In her invocation that we just saw, Tornabuoni is explicitly asking for help, taking on the submissive role contrary to a Luciferian translator governed by the rebellious motto, "I do not serve." Yet at the same time that Tornabuoni asks for a companion, she takes what I consider the rather bold stance of adding herself to a journey. As we'll see, this concept of addition that comes to characterize her project is based on a language of accompaniment that Tornabuoni can be said to have gleaned both from the biblical text as well as from practices of late medieval biblical commentary. And as we'll see, there's another way of thinking about her additions in a way that De Campos might well have found relevant. A De Campos who goes on to introduce the translator as what he calls a choreographer of the internal dance of language. The introduction of a musical metaphor is notable in Tornabuoni's own allusion to accompaniment, particularly when we consider that her prayer is specifically for turning prose into verse, mettere in versi, transforming the stolid work of narrative into a dance through the addition of the rhythm provided by meter. As she says at the beginning of another one of her translations, the Storia of Judith, regarding the biblical text, she says, "I found it written in prose, l'ho trovato così scritta in prosa." And she was sufficiently inspired by Judith's ardire or boldness to want to tell Judith's story. In the case of Judith, Tornabuoni would use ottava rima, 8-line stanzas that were used for the cantari that were sung daily in Florence's piazze. The terza rima, in which she wrote the Vita di Tobia, was perhaps even more effective in contributing to a sense of ongoing movement, the form Dante, of course, had invented for his journey into the afterlife, to be recited and memorized by generations of Italians to come, some of whom are no doubt in this room. And in some ways, Dante's journey on the incognita via, or unknown way, parallels that of the boy Tobias, whose guided tour begins with a nasty encounter with a big fish and with demons, and ends in the resplendent light of a Raphael, revealing himself as an angel. Hence, Dante's rhyme scheme was, for many reasons, a suitable setting for the biblical book Tornabuoni sought to turn into versi. As in great translation, so in a great musical setting, something is added to the original text. But that which is added was already there. The quote is from George Steiner's After Babel, one of the founding works of translation studies from the 1970s. The exuberant reference to music, what Steiner often suggested was the superior art, is, as so much of Steiner's work, symptomatic of his conviction in the power of art to transcend the limitations of human experience. Tornabuoni's translation, I'll be honest, can hardly be called great. And indeed, it's not entirely clear what her role as a translator entailed. It's unlikely she would have known the Latin of the Vulgate well enough to have done this work without the assistance of one of the Florentine humanists in the employ of her son Lorenzo, himself a competent Latinist who translated, among others, Boethius. Erminio Ardisino, who came out with an edition of Vita di Tobia only in 2017, its first publication as a text, has recently argued that a vernacular Bible, now in Lyon, was a possible source for Tornabuoni's verses, although the absence of the first of the 3 manuscript volumes, where the Book of Tobias would have been found, means there's no way to compare Tornabuoni's translation with this presumed source. Tornabuoni's status as a translator from the Latin into what she calls the dolce idiome, or the sweet idiom of Tuscan, must therefore remain an open question. Yet this ambiguity will be productive rather than problematic regarding Tornabuoni's request for what she calls the process of accompagnare, the setting into verse that provides prose with rhythm and sound in the achingly familiar meter of her compatriot Dante. Steiner's analogy helps us envision a parallel movement or dance of music and words. And in fact, his chief example of such a great musical setting is also based on a journey, to return to the quote, the composer Henri Duparc's setting of one of Baudelaire's most famous poems, Invitation au Voyage. As Steiner put it, in listening to Duparc, one feels precisely in what ways the composer is, quote, letting Baudelaire's words be more than themselves, and thus entirely themselves. How does placing the Book of Tobias, and subsequently the Book of Esther and the story of Susanna, some of her other translations, into terza rima, make these biblical tales more than what they are, and perhaps exactly what they are? And is establishing exactly what they are even the point? My remarks from henceforth will address what's at stake in the kinds of modal and textual additions that Tornabuoni plotted as she set about her self-imposed task, beginning with angels, as in the words of Kate Briggs, whose recent book in translation studies, This Little Art, is a wonderful introduction to the field. So in the words of Kate Briggs, as Tornabuoni effectively went about, quote, adding herself to an existing work as its translator. Briggs's reflections on her vocation are informed by her awareness of translation as a largely secondary practice, one often done by women. Yet the hierarchy that Briggs assumes between another's work and the work performed by the translator has been usefully complicated by another scholar, in this case, Karen Emmerich. In her recent emphasis on the often messy production of originals, Emmerich challenges the concept of a fixed source and questions the authenticity or unmediated nature of so-called originals. As a result, Emmerich reassesses translation not as loss, and the act of translation not as a secondary kind of job, but as perpetual, if uneven, growth and gain. Growth and gain are critical to Tornabuoni's conceptualization of her work as well, a growth implicit but unrealized in the origins that Emmerich herself demystifies. At the close of her Storia di San Giovanni Battista, Tornabuoni suggests that she's recounted San Giovanni's birth and death so that my and others' devotion to him may grow. Che a me ed altri cresca devozione. And something else grew as well in the case of her life of San Giovanni Battista, most likely Tornabuoni's last work. The story itself, from the slim accounts found scattered throughout the 4 Gospels to a poem of 159 ottave. Tornabuoni's earlier Vita di Tobia, far closer to the biblical text and far shorter than San Giovanni Battista, nonetheless also shows signs of growth and gain. Did Tornabuoni see her additions, modal, textual, and personal as they are, as giving the text something that was already there, or rather taking it in a new direction? And was Raphael the right companion for her voyage? So let me just say a little bit about the Book of Tobias, since I know some of you may not be as familiar with it as others. Composed in the 2nd or late 1st century BCE, the Book of Tobias, like so much of the Hebrew Bible, was indeed one of the messy texts that Emmerich had in mind when she complicates the notion of an original, not least because there are multiple manuscripts of this story extant in at least 2 languages, Hebrew and Greek. Indeed, for centuries, the Bible itself was marked by instability and presumed incompleteness, as seen by the addition of Genesis 1 to the already existing Genesis 2 and 3, or the repetition of the wife-sister stories in later chapters of Genesis. But the Book of Tobias, composed by and about a Hebrew community living in exile, exemplifies addition in a more organic way. When Raphael prepares to leave with the young Tobias on the journey, he tells Tobias's father that he will, quote, lead him out safely, and safely will I bring your son back to you. But it turns out to be more than a journey of preservation, or even of restoration, as one of Tobias's medieval women readers well knew. In Book 7 of her Celestial Revelations, written about a century before Tornabuoni wrote her poem, Bridget of Sweden recalls Raphael's reassuring phrase in regard to a defining moment late in her own life. God has instructed her to travel on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Quoting Raphael, as he says to her, I shall lead you there, and I shall bring you back to Rome. Educam et reducam vos ad Roma. And he continues, and I shall procure for you what you need more sufficiently than you ever had before. Bridget's God has done his reading, for at the end of the Book of Tobias, the characters do indeed receive more than they ever had before. Tornabuoni notes this in a synopsis that she provides immediately following her invocation. The young Tobias returns not only with his father's money, but with Sara, a donna di nobile affare, as his wealthy bride, along with gold and silver, and he received as many sheep as he did oxen and camels, and all was restored, and he was greatly contented. Tornabuoni does use the word ristorato, but the implications are clear. Tobias has far more at the end of the story than he had before, thanks in no small part to his son's finding a wealthy wife. Being an angel, Raphael had many other talents. His status as the patron saint of healing has, of course, long been noted, given his ability to cure Tobias's blindness, and his name, in fact, means, literally, he who heals. This role as healer, central to the emerging network of spedali in late medieval Tuscany, is also connected to the practice of misericordia and charity. And your wonderful colleague here at Toronto, Conrad Eisenbichler, who is with us today, has written extensively on the Florentine confraternity named after Raffaello in the early 15th century, a group of young men who became known for their own theatrical representations, as well as for their commitment to charity for the needy. And as stated in its statutes, the Compagnie of Raphael states that, quote, the love of God and neighbor be understood not only as extending to our friends, that is, to the brothers of our company, but also to enemies and to strangers. If the practice of charity results in gain and growth in a community, we can also think of a more secular version of growth, that of money. As the companion of Tobias, Raphael also becomes a figure frequently invoked by parents who send their sons out as breadwinners. Erwin Panofsky, in a seminal article, addressed some of the many devotional panels and paintings dedicated to the saint and given to young boys in late medieval Europe, off to university or to launch their careers as merchants. And we might even think of the Verrocchio painting as a kind of, way of reflecting on these young boys going out to find money and bring it back home and make their family even wealthier. Tornabuoni took this additive process quite seriously, adding not only her prayer at the beginning, as we've just seen, but additional passages that were not in the Vulgate text. To an extent, she follows what had been a long-respected medieval practice, adding commentary through sermons most immediately, but in treatises and the medieval biblical manuscripts through secondary marginal notes. The rise of the Vulgare in the late medieval period encouraged attempts to establish a kind of parity between Latin and a new language in search of its own authority and grammatica. The scholar Alison Cornish, who I cited last week, has suggested that as volgarizzamenti effectively muted the fundamental cultural differences between ancient and contemporary worlds, so too did translations of religious texts, including the Bible, render them less sacred, more on a par with other edifying literature. And that's quite a thing to be thinking about, right? How to bring the Bible into a less sacred context and a more familiar and usable one. Once equated with other literatures, the biblical text became available for the interspersing of comments and reflections by people other than the religious elite. Cornish goes on to suggest that translation itself becomes seen as a work of charity, of misericordia, the rules of which are found actually for the first time in the Book of Tobias. This relationship to charity is apparent in the dedicatory letter to the first published Bibbia in Volgare by the Camaldese monk Niccolò Malerbi, who supposedly carried out his project of translating the entire Bible in a mere 8 months. We really don't believe that. He must have had a lot of help, or he had really been doing it for years. So in his preface, he writes, "But we who have received the sacrament of the Christian vocation, and hence to whom the truth of God has been revealed, call together all equally, no matter their sex or their age, to partake in this heavenly and most useful food. Convochiamo tutti universalmente senza alcuna differenza di maschio o di femmine." So women and men are part of this effort to spread the word of the Bible. Even as he insists in his preface that, like Jerome, he is being faithful to his biblical source, Malerbi notes that given the differences between Latin and the Vulgate, at times it's necessary, here's the key word for me, to amplify, è stato ampliato per necessità, for the satisfaction and greater consolation of one's readers. He even approvingly cites Horace's criticism of the fides interpretes, right, the altogether too faithful translator, who stays too close to the text, while hastening to add that his own translation doesn't depart from the sentiment or sentimento of the Latin. As he submits his work in this letter to his superior, a Franciscan theologian, Malherbe invokes the importance of the dritta via, or straight road, that he has shown his illiterate readers, calling attention to his role as a trustworthy guide. Amplificazione was the kind of work Tornabuoni took seriously. If vulgarization meant bringing these healing words closer to those who have been distant from them, one way Tornabuoni achieves this is by adding commentary to key moments of her text. Written barely a century before the birth of Christ, the Book of Tobias was seen as especially poised to anticipate the imminent Christian dispensation. And Tornabuoni adds phrasing that links conspicuously Old Testament and New. And I give you here one example. When at the end of the journey and they're back at home, Raphael reveals his identity, i.e., I'm an angel, and abruptly departs, going back to heaven, claiming that his time on earth is done. Tornabuoni introduces a line that looks intriguingly to the final chapter of Luke's Gospel, and those of you who were here last week might remember this moment. Stunned or stupefatti by what they have learned from Raphael, the family members, after Raphael has disappeared, say to one another, "Era il cor nostri di Pietro di Sasso, come non sia l'arso o consumato, pensando chi per noi discese a basso." Are our hearts made of rock or stone? How is it they haven't been burned or consumed in thinking who descended below for us? These are not lines from the Book of Tobias. But as Erminio Ardisino has noted in her edition, they echo the question of the disciples at Emmaus. After Christ, breaking the bread, after his walking with the disciples to the gates of the city, suddenly vanishes and ascends. And quote, "They said to one another, were not our hearts burning cor nostrum ardens, when he spoke to us on the way and opened to us the scripture." The burning hearts, the reference to Raphael's descent to earth, and to the way he disappeared from their eyes like a lightning bolt, da loro occhi sparì come baleno, all suggest Raphael's likeness to the resurrected Christ. Both appear in disguise, both explain hidden truths on the road, and both depart in a flash. And shortly before Raphael's disappearance in the Bible, the angel says, "Now I reveal to you the truth and no longer conceal anything from you." It's my second example of Tornabuoni adding. Tornabuoni will frame this revelation, one of the Book of Tobias's most solemn moments, within the context of a colloquial phrase, edging her readers toward divine secrets by way of familiar vernacular circumlocutions, rather than explicit New Testament references. So here she says, when Raphael makes this revelation, here's how Tornabuoni puts it in the Italian. "La verità è quella che sta verde. Io non vi vocelare il mio sermone, né mostrare più a voi bianco per verde." Some very colloquial expressions here as she's having an angel speak to them. This freshness is arguably the freshness of a new tongue, thanks to a Tornabuoni who is making it verde. While there's also an allusion here to the greenness of things that flourish and grow, emphasized through the repetition of verde at the end rhyme two lines later. In this leisurely unwinding of a colloquial phrase, we hear Tornabuoni's reflections on her role as someone who reveals secrets that were formerly hidden, carrying them across from one language, one realm to another, and so making them manifest. But as a new language, Tuscan was not yet entirely to be trusted. In his preface to his sonnets, Tornabuoni's son Lorenzo de Medici claimed that the Tuscan of the late 15th century was still in its adolescenza, still a teenager, who needed proper upbringing in order to attain greater perfection and ultimately reach entire continents as Latin had once done. And obviously the work you're doing here in Toronto has meant bringing Italian to this continent as well, which is great. Lorenzo would be proud. This allusion must be read in the context of Lorenzo's ambitions to conquer the Tuscan countryside and bring towns like Volterra, Pisa, and others under the Fiorentino Impero. But it also conveys a keen understanding of his mother tongue and his mother's tongue as relatively young and vulnerable, in need of assistance as it traveled out of town. To travel successfully to the right audience in the right way, it had to be appropriately accompanied and adorned, added to in ways that would ensure its safe arrival in the proper hands. To return to George Steiner, and to another way of thinking about additions, one such way was music. By Dante's time, the word accompagnare was being used to describe the addition of music to a poem for purposes of performance as a form of sostegno or support. One of the earliest uses of the term is found in the anonymous poem that is a response to the canzone in Dante's Vita Nuova, Donne che avete intelletto d'amore. Dante ends his canzone with a congedo, typical of the canzone form, giving it precise instructions about where to go and what to say. Reveal yourself solo con donne o con uomo cortese che ti marranno là per via Toscana. The anonymous respondent took quite seriously the idea of the road on which the canzone must travel. He has his poem, an answer to Dante's poem, speak directly to Dante at the end. Io andrò, ne son già miga in bando, in tale guisa sono accompagnata, che si mi sento bene assicurata, che io spero andare e ridir tutta sana. I will go forth, not at all into exile. I'm so well accompanied that I feel confident enough to hope to leave and return sana, safely, the same word that we see used in regard to Raphael promising Tobias, I will bring your son home safely. In this instance, the poet plays on the possibility of the poem finding the right woman or courteous man, as well as what may have been a musical companion. The performative sonic dimension helped ensure an audience's receptivity, and even though the song might be away for weeks or months, semana o mese, the completion of her mission is not in doubt, thanks to her being accompagnata. At the same time, according to Dante himself, verse was already musical. As Dante argues in the De Vulgari Eloquentia, those who write in the vernacular should rightly be called poets, since the essence of poetry is nothing other than an invention composed in verse that is based on the principles of both rhetoric and music. Dante goes on to say that because the proper rules have not yet been formulated for the Vulgare, writers in the vernacular are still far behind those who write in Latin in terms of the excellence of their verse. Dante took it upon himself to create those rules for eloquence in the Vulgare, to cite the title of his treatise. And he did so in part by advocating that Latin be imitated as closely as possible. Yet when it comes to verse, each language has something distinctly its own. Or as Dante puts it in his Convivio, nothing harmonized by means of its musical bond can be translated from its own tongue into another without destroying all of its sweetness and harmony. The musical hold on verse, its meter, its rhythm, exacts something so unique and specific that it defies translation. The Psalms of the Vulgate, translated from Hebrew into Greek and then into Latin, according to Dante, lack sweetness and harmony, sono senza dolcezza e armonia, qualities that almost 2 centuries later, Lorenzo would characterize as crucial for elevating or dignifying a language. According to this way of reading, translation can convey a poem's content, but not its euphony and connotation. At the same time, if for Dante, the legame mosaico, a musical bond, is definitive of poetry, then verse already embodies what Marco Agnetta has called intersemiosity, a space in which the elements are no longer just language, but also music. Might Tornabuoni's request for an accompanying angel reflect her interest in exploring the Vulgate's sonic ability to reach in more than one way her listeners? That this versification might be thought of in terms of musical translation, in the sense to which Steiner alluded, may seem less of a stretch when considering how critical Dante and his contemporaries were in setting forth a view of verse as an extension of music by virtue of its rhythm and its meter. For another way of conceptualizing the practice of accompaniment is to envision what is added, not only in spatial terms, but temporally, as a form of expanded time and space. Repetition not simply of words, but of a particular verse form, like terza rima, stretches time by acclimating the listener to a rhythm or a melody, ideally making it familiar. If the accompaniment of music can make Baudelaire's words more than themselves, and thus entirely themselves, Raphael's accompanying presence enables the same with respect to the characters. The elderly Tobias can see again. The young Tobias can move into the manhood that fulfills who he was meant to be. Tornabuoni arguably provides such an expansive setting through her additions to the story, but she also achieves it through a verse form that, with its rhythms and rhyme, approximates a musical retelling, one based in sound, and perhaps meant purposefully to be recited aloud. And as we learn from a letter from Angelo Poliziano to Tornabuoni in 1479, one of her presumably not yet reading granddaughters has already learned one of Tornabuoni's poemetti by heart. So they were listening. These were stories that were being read out loud. Moreover, in embedding the Book of Tobias into the rhyme scheme of her compatriot Dante, Tornabuoni allows us to hear the journey of the commedia as well, its metrical elaborations that wound up taking its readers to paradise, compelling us with their insistently forward movement to read on. The rhythm and repetitiveness of terza rima in turn facilitates the arrival of Tornabuoni's work among her readers, already accustomed to Dante's verse. As a result, Tornabuoni's use of the idea of companionship for her translational role militates against the sense of superiority and aloneness seen in contemporary paradigms of translators of secular works, particularly those who translated from the Greek, but not only. 60 years before Tornabuoni began doing her own translation, the Florentine humanist Leonardo Bruni composed what is commonly considered the first modern treatise about translation. In his unfinished De Interpretazione Recta, Bruni writes that the accomplished translator must, quote, transfer himself, convertet, and transform himself, transformabit, into his source. He must speak as Aristotle would have spoken. There is at once a submissive ring to this, transforming oneself into someone else, while at the same time there's an egoistic edge that nicely matches Bruni's irritation at having been criticized for his translation of Aristotle's Ethics. He assumes that he could write as though he were Aristotle for the modern age. Elsewhere in his preface to his Latin translation of Plato's Gorgias, Bruni would proudly announce, habet enum hoc Plato, Plato is here. His preface to the translation of one of Basil's sermons ends with his phrase, now let us listen to Basil. So confidence, right, in that he's actually giving us the men themselves. A visual version, several centuries later, of Bruni's confidence can be seen in the imposing frontispiece to the 17th century translation into English of Xenophon's Cyropaedia. Here, the English translator, Philemon Holland, literally fills the entire folio page, a presentation that acknowledges the fundamental role of the interpres. One of England's most prolific translators, Holland also published works of Livy, Pliny, and Suetonius into English, and the presence of his portrait at the beginning of his work, along with his family crest and indication of his esteemed age of 80 years old, suggests a man who saw his work as secondary to none. And I can't resist from giving you an image of the Italian John Florio, who similarly placed himself in relationship to Michel de Montaigne. He translated the massive work of Michel de Montaigne's essays in the early 17th century into English. But if you look at the title page, essays by Michel de Montaigne, and then in full caps, done into English by John Florio. And here is John Florio, not Michel de Montaigne, looking out at us from the title page. Again, the folio-size portrait of the translator, not the actual author. But regardless of whether we understand translation as displacing the original author, which is what Florio seems to be doing, or bringing the author back in his entirety, which is what Bruni sees himself as doing, Tornabuoni seems to envision her own work as a going together, an adding of another. Any notion of the self-sustainability of the translated text gives way instead to something else, which might finally be defined as the form of proximity known as friendship, a proximity perhaps best articulated by Dante. In his Convivio, or banquet, Dante writes of sharing bread with his readers in the form of their common tongue, as he closes his prefatory remarks defending his use of the Vulgate rather than Latin. Dante offers us pane orzato, fine wheat bread, in baskets that are overflowing, sporte piene, surely an allusion to the gospel story of the loaves and the fishes, and hence alluding to the theme of the growth and the gain that translation and the vernacular can provide. The passage also reminds us of the real meaning of compagno, someone with whom we eat bread, right? This is what the word compagno literally means. Dante has just been describing the sense of well-being that comes from familiarity or consuetudine, a familiarity he links to friendship. And over the years, he has attained such a friendship with the Volgare, the Italian spoken to him by his parents and his friends. Quote, di questa concordia l'amistà è confermata e accresciuta. This process of familiarizing through friendship is then extended to his readers in the form of poems and commentary composed in the language of their daily bread, rather than in Latin. These writings, in turn, will bring them what Dante characterizes in his final sentence to his prefatory chapter as a new light, a new sun, luce nuova, sole nuovo, again highlighting vernacular translation as a kind of charity. Bread is shared at the end of the Book of Tobias in a quite literal way, when the young boy and his angelic companion return home and celebrate a feast with the elderly Tobias, to whom his sight has been miraculously restored. Importantly, though, for everything I've said so far, Raphael, being an angel, does not eat. Or as Tornabuoni puts it, he only seemed to be eating, but nobody noticed that he wasn't, right? Ma non mangiavo, says Raphael in Tornabuoni's translation, e non vi accorgiate, right? No, you didn't see that I wasn't actually eating. The angel, in short, only pretends to be a true companion, right? He's not someone who is going to eat bread with us. A word that postdates the Vulgate, but obviously not Tornabuoni, given that Tobias instructs his son to find un buon compagno, which in the Latin the phrase is simply fidelum virum. As Meredith Gill writes, Raphael's errand depends on visual deception. He has duped his human family, although for good ends. And in fact, while Raphael is presented in the play as the speaker of all the world's languages, he isn't particularly needed to translate among humans in the story, all of whom seem to speak Hebrew. His linguistic virtuosity is rather on display when exorcising the demon that possesses Sarah, the woman who will marry Tobias, or with regard to the savage fish and its medicinal uses for curing the elder Tobias's blindness. This is trafficking in the language of animals and demons, for which a very special tongue is required. And of course, Raphael is not human himself, as Dante stipulated in Paradiso in his one allusion to the angel in the Commedia. For Dante, however, it's not a question of deception, but of loving accommodation to mankind's limited faculties. Curiously, as he brings in the word so key to the Book of Tobias to refer to the act of healing, once again, sano, Dante omits Raphael's name, possibly his way of respecting the concealed identity of the angel in the course of the biblical book. If the angel who healed Tobias is deceptive, what of the person who asks for such an angel in the first place? And doesn't Raphael's revelation of himself as an angel make Tornabuoni our real companion? After all, she actually shares the bread with her readers so that they learn the way to salvation through her words. In this way, she's the one who establishes the bond of familiarity, or as Dante puts it, proximitade, proximity, that allows them to eat together. And it is salvation that Tornabuoni seeks for both her characters and her readers. In her invocation, she used the word salvamento rather than sano to refer to Tobias's return home. Chieli andò e tornò a salvamento. Salvamento does mean safety, but it also carries with it the inference of spiritual salvation. Thus does Tobias receive the same dispensation as Tornabuoni's readers, yet another way of achieving familiarity through what is, in this case, an expansive translation that might play on the proximity of one word and one meaning to another. It may have been proximity that allowed Tornabuoni's invocation to be heard, if not by God, at least by one contemporary writer. Another angel standing at another threshold, the congedo of the play I mentioned at the very beginning, La Festa, la rappresentazione dell'Angelo Raphael di Tobia, notably returns to Tornabuoni's opening, repeating words that, to be sure, were not unusual in the context of Tobias, but that nonetheless are closely paired. As he bids the audience goodbye at the end of the play, the angel leaves them with some guidance. Be just like Tobit. He was rewarded by the Lord of heaven. Fu dal Signore dal ciel ristorato. Again, we see this word restored. If you too want as guardian and friend, guardia e compagnia, the angel Raphael, turn your back on sin, for he is guardian of Florence the fair, il quale guarda l'alma Fiorenza, and praising God, I bid you all farewell. Guardia e compagnia, ristorato. These words take us directly back to Tornabuoni's opening invocation. The play was published around 1483. Tornabuoni had died a year earlier, and as we know from letters of colleagues who read her works, her poems were in circulation in the late 1470s. There's thus a strong possibility that the playwright was connected to the Medici circle and knew of Tornabuoni's work. Of special interest is the repetition of Guardia in relationship to Florence, as though Raphael, not John the Baptist, were Florence's patron saint. Here's where we might think of Raphael in his more traditional role, not as patron saint of travelers or a linguist, but of the sick, Raphael as healer, and hence medico. The Medici had emerged in the mid-15th century as Florence's new guardians, for better or worse. And Tornabuoni herself, especially after her husband's death, became a figure looked to and even prayed to for healing, for charity, for salvamento of various kinds. This moment at the end of a play that seems surely indebted to Tornabuoni's translation, whether into Italian or into Dantesque verse, extends the charitable role that Tornabuoni played, now in memoriam. But this memoriam may also have a special gendered focus. In a recent article, Nerida Newbegin, who provided the translation for this ottava, has hypothesized that the author of this play is none other than Antonia Pulci, whose husband Bernardo translated Virgil's Eclogues, and whose brother-in-law Luigi dedicated his sprawling romance The Morgante to Tornabuoni herself. While Bernardo was also a writer of sacre rappresentazioni and has been connected to this play, Newbigin sees the style of La Festa dell'Angelo Raffaello as more in keeping with Antonia's extensive work. Antonia, moreover, like Tornabuoni, was fascinated by the stories of religious women. If not Judith and Esther, then Santa Domitilla, Guglielma, and Rosanna. As Newbigin says, and I quote, Pulci's female model in her literary aspirations was without question Lorenzo's mother, Lucrezia Tornabuoni, who had allowed her own works to circulate in manuscript among women who learned them by heart. The fact that there are telling echoes between the play about Tobias and Tornabuoni's riscrittura of the biblical text of Tobias validates, I think, Newbigin's claim and opens up an important new way for thinking about the Medici circle. It lets us take stock not just of its humanists like Poliziano and Ficino, or its ruling male members like Lorenzo and Cosimo, but of its women, and the collaborations and arguably companionship that at least two women writers, Pulci and Tornabuoni, no doubt shared. So this relationship between Tornabuoni and other women of her time, like Pulci, is not so much, of course, one of translation as of a simple sharing of texts, even as we might argue that Antonia becomes a translator writ large, translating Tornabuoni's terza rima into ottava rima and her poetic version of the Book of Tobias into a play. But let me close by reflecting on a more personal and direct experience of companionship with regard to translation. When I translated 20 years ago Tornabuoni's Storie Sacre, so Tobias and her other poems on Judith and Esther and etc., my only friend were the silent manuscripts that I encountered in Florence's Biblioteca Nazionale and the Casa Matense. When much more recently I set out to translate Dacia Maraini's Chiara di Assisi, and here is her book and my recent translation, I had the benefit of a living author, someone to whom I could ask questions, or to use a Pirandellian metaphor that Dacia often cites, on whose door I could knock in the hope of getting something to eat, and with luck, I might be invited to spend the night. But when I first started drafting a version of the translation, I didn't realize I got to knock at the author's door at all, much less be invited in. After several months went by without hearing from me, Dacia wrote me one day a hasty note. And I wish I still had the email, I don't. Cara Jane, why aren't you bugging me? Why would I bother this busy woman who was churning out like a novel once a year, writing her weekly rubrica for the Repubblica, giving more talks, workshops, and seminars than any other person I knew, and she was already over 80 years old. I mean, I was not going to bother Dacia. Yet Dacia wanted to be bothered. She wanted me to engage with her with questions, uncertainties, curiosities. And so we met in Rome for several days in her lovely apartment near the Villa Borghese, stacked everywhere, of course, with books. And when we went out for meals, she was always polite when fans, young and old, would stop her in restaurants to ask her politely for an autograph or to comment on recent news. Unlike the author I discussed last week, the mysterious Elena Ferrante, Dacia wants to engage and to be engaged with and by her readers and her translators. Even as she says, and I quote her directly, I prefer to let the books I've written sleep. Sounds like Ferrante. Left behind, although they actually do not sleep at all. Because they travel the world, and every now and then I happen to come across them, filled with unfamiliar writing, bound by a jacket in which I don't recognize myself, i.e. when they're translated into Chinese or German or Japanese, or in many of the other languages into which they have been translated. I think she's been translated into over 25 different languages, so she knows what she's talking about here. This quote is from an interview Dacia and I did together in London at the Istituto Italiano di Cultura in 2018, subsequently published in the journal Donna Lingua Letteratura. It reminds me of a moment in the work of Jacques Derrida, when Derrida remarks in a late interview that every time a work of writing leaves me, he feels as though he is suffering a kind of death, and that when that work returns in a new form, he feels estranged from it. This is clearly the fate of anything we send out, whether it's simply published or translated, but every act of publication and transmission is already a mediation, and hence there is always some kind of difference. Still, after Dacia said this during our interview, I asked her somewhat persistently until she answered me as to whether, despite this lack of recognition, and despite the wide range of work she's done over the years in theater and poetry, novels, journalism, if she recognized, or if her readers might recognize, some kind of continuity. And here was her answer. I usually say that behind every style there is a musical structure, which you can see in poetry. There it is very easy to find. You cannot see it that easily when you are reading prose, but it is there, and if you close your eyes, then you can hear that there is a rhythm. I am certain that this musical rhythm behind every style is exactly what you are able to communicate to people. It is the musical side, not the content. I mean, the content is important too, but it's not the only thing. You can have the most beautiful story in the world, but if you don't have this bridge that connects you to the reader, which is made of rhythm and musicality, then it doesn't work. So you might imagine I'm struck by the connection between Dacia's metaphor of music and my earlier attempt in tonight's talk to link the translator to the accompanist, to the recognition and generation of the rhythm and musicality that exists in another's work, or to return for the last time to George Steiner, to adding something that was, quote, already there. I could never say that in any of my 3 book-length translations I have done that. Certainly not for Tornabuoni, whose terza rima I didn't even begin to try to work with. While for Gaspara Stampa, I sought to listen for and hence create the rhythm of her 12-syllable lines, and where the rhyme of a sonnet might feel unforced, to offer the sounds in English as well. Dacia's own style, obviously I didn't translate a poem, but I translated one of her novels, is deceptively simple and straightforward. She is an experimentalist in terms of her structure and her narrative. Chiara di Assisi moves from an epistolary novel to a set of entries in a quaderno, and then back to the dialogue form. But Dacia's prose, while never flat and always evocative, is also always to the point. It has, I think, what one might call a staccato rhythm, keeping us alert, awake, never indulging our desire to daydream or rest. Whether I've been able to bring forth her own particular musical style, the punctuations of relatively short sentences, the scrupulous attentiveness of the narrative voice, the steady drumbeat of moving forward amidst arresting returns to the past, I can't really say. And I'm just throwing out here, I'm not going to read through it, but here's one attempt, and it's actually a passage I worked with Dacia on when I met her in Rome, because I wanted to be sure I was getting the sensibility right here. It's toward the end of the first section of the novel, where the young girl who has been trying to get Dacia to write a novel about Clare of Assisi is very happy that Dacia is going to do it. And shortly after saying this girl who's anorexic and who's been starving herself to be like Clare just vanishes from the narrative. So again, I'm not going to read through it, but you can see sono io che barcolo la testa leggera. There's a kind of staccato-like rhythm in so much of what Dacia is doing. And like I said, I tried in one way or another to represent Dacia's own attachment to what she calls the musicality and the rhythm of her prose. Ultimately, regarding Dacia, and I'll close, I can only suggest that my own journey to publishing this slender book that came out with Rutgers Press last year was one I happily did not take alone. At Dacia's insistence, I had a companion. She was my Raphael. And she has been unfailingly generous in including me by her side in a series of interviews and exchanges in Europe and the US about not just the book Chiara di Assisi, but her work more generally. Raphael, as we've seen, had many gifts and many things to offer the lesser humans with which he consorted. And to return to the passage with which I opened from Antonio Pucci's play, we see him portrayed not simply as a traveler of the world, but a linguist who knows tutti i linguaggi del mondo. He fights against the effects of Babel, capable of bringing together people who had long been separated. As I've wandered around Toronto these past 8 days, I can't help but remark on a figure who seems very much like a modern Raphael. I'm not going to read this whole plaque, which is outside the Church of San Francesco di Assisi, but Grace Bagnato, who I'm sure some of you have heard of, was apparently a Raphael in her day, the daughter of Italian immigrants who learned Yiddish, Polish, Ukrainian, and worked in the courts here in Toronto for decades. And as this plaque quite beautifully says, on Grace Street outside of San Francesco, she built bridges of understanding between new immigrants and the English-speaking world, not an easy world, of law, courts, and society. Let me close with one last woman, not a modern one, and not someone from Toronto, but the biblical Esther, to whom Tornabuoni dedicated another work which also reflects the additive tendencies of its author, more forcefully here than in the earlier Tubio. Esther, as you may know, is a Hebrew who has disguised her identity and who has become one of King Ahasuerus' preferred consorts in his harem, ultimately becoming his wife. When Esther learns that one of Ahasuerus' counselors is advocating the slaughter of all the Jews in his kingdom, she takes it upon herself to enter the king's chamber unannounced in order to beg him to spare her people. Such a choice is a virtual death sentence, even though Esther is technically Ahasuerus' favorite wife. She must speak with sufficient force to win him over to her petition, and find the courage to confess that she herself is a Jew, which she does not yet know. Before she addresses Ahasuerus in Tornabuoni's translation, Tornabuoni gives her a brief prayer that is not found in the Vulgate, ending with these words: "O my Lord, teach me how to speak, insegnami parlare, che io sappia dir parola che sia accetta." And her words, Esther's words, are indeed accepted. Far from ordering her to be killed, Ahasuerus gives her leave to talk, and she asks him to dine with her the next day, when she will reveal the plot against the Jews and so save her people. This positioning of the early modern accompanists suggests another way of conceptualizing the project of translation writ large. Should the translator seek the sense of superiority and aloneness witnessed in Philemon Holland's portrait, evincing the self-sustainability of the translated text? Or can there only be the illusion of doing it alone, particularly if translation is really the product of a dialogue, interspersed with moments of recognizing oneself in the original writer? If the expansiveness of musical accompaniment enables listeners to experience the simultaneous journey of poet and composer, translation arguably affects such an expansion too, albeit in a way that is less synchronous. We can only infer the journey between translator and guide. With her prayers, her colloquial additions, and her metrical soundscape, Tornabuoni intimates the process of a friendship grounded in the familiar, one that extends to her readers and to the young volgare itself. Raphael makes himself familiar, but he must return to his strange home elsewhere. The guide Lucrezia remains with her text to the very end, as she attempts to satisfy its longing for migration, while at the same time bringing it home. In effect, Tornabuoni becomes our angel, the giver of bread, like Dante, to those who can now join in at the table, our interpreter and companion on a pilgrimage of reading. As Erminio Ardesino writes, ultimately Tornabuoni's aim, working in the sweet idiom, was to cultivate devotion and familiarity with the story of salvation, reaching out to a public that was not comfortable with Latin, especially women, as well as to ennoble a language that deserved to become a banner for Florence's greatness. Is it not finally this familiarity that is the most meaningful result of Tornabuoni's accompaniment, as she enables future readers and listeners to take part in Tobias's risky adventure? Her Vita di Tobia closes not with a reminder of her presence, but with lines referring to the perseverance of Tobias's heirs in doing opere buone, good works, a reminder of the text's penchant for establishing growth, and to the younger Tobias's death as an old man. The final words are il ver riposo, true rest, God's final gift to this boy who walked with an angel, and the true rest that perhaps Tornabuoni now seeks that she's finally finished her translation. As she and the playwright who may have been Antonio Polci sought to accompany and so add to others' words, they arguably transformed what would otherwise have been a solitary, potentially dangerous journey into a shared venture. And I'll just close alluding to the painting on my right. This is from Ghirlandaio's Stories of Mary in Santa Maria Novella. Tornabuoni ended up getting herself added to this painting that is about not exactly a biblical story, the birth of Mary, but a story that becomes infused with biblical significance. This is her right here watching the birth of the young Mary. Thank you for all your attention, and I welcome questions.
Thank you so much. So we have all the time for some questions. Who would like to start?
25 years ago, I translated 427 Rubaiyatova Markhayam in the modern English.
Huh.
I emphasize the word modern because Edward Fitzgerald was never sufficient for my appreciation of Markhayam. He was a kind of flowery, romantic Victorian, you know.
Huh.
And Markhayam was a man of science, a mathematician, an astronomer, and he was really man down to earth. So I spent 427 days, translated 427 rubaiyats. I'll explain you why. The rubaiyat is a traditional form, and it's a rhyme poetry.
Okay.
Every line has 12 syllables. First and second and fourth line rhyme, and third doesn't rhyme. But you translate such poetry in another language. It has to be also rhymed.
Yeah.
Because, like you said several times, poetry is a music. The poetry is not musical, it's not poetry. It is a prose pretending to be a poetry. So after I translated it, I published it, and then some people read it, and some people I'll read it to them, and they start asking me the question, Nick, my name is Nick. I said, is it you or is it Amar Khayyam? And I said, it's both.
Yeah,
And that's why I call it free translation.
Yeah.
And that's what we call talking about this. You submerge yourself in a writer which you translate.
Absolutely.
It's a convergence or merger and acquisition, if you wish to use the modern language. You have to be part. You became one.
Yeah.
But you create something new, like adding, you mentioned. So two similarities converge, and they created something which is next to this. And this is a kind of a progress or dialectic of the art or the society of anything, but it's not Hegelian dialectic when everything is a struggle. It's a different type of dialectic. On the contrary, two similarities converge together on friendly basis. It creates something new. And this is not the first time it happened to me. When I was a teenager in high school, I wrote an essay of women in poetry of Nekrasov, one of the great Russian poets. So our teacher of Russian literature, who is the principal of school, she liked it very much. She read it in class, But later she asked me, Nick, can you tell me which line is yours and which line is Nekrasov?
Wow.
And I couldn't tell her because I was so much permeated by Nekrasov that I started writing by Nekrasov. You know what I'm talking?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's
the
fantastic.
question is, were you submerged and you felt so inside Dacia through your experience or no?
No, this is,
Like
I mean,
how
the idea
the
of submersion
conversation
is
was.
interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
no. I mean, I think I have to say it depends, I think, on how the text is speaking to you and how you want it to speak to you. I remember when I was translating Gaspar Estampa, so she has 309 poems, most of which are sonnets, but there are also some longer canzoni and a few other capitoli in her opus. And I would often do it at night, and I would often do it on the subway on my way back from work or something like that, because it took my mind off, like running a department or writing a scholarly article. It was like a creative kind of work that I could just do with another side of my brain, I think is kind of how I was like mainly coming to this. And I think by just freeing up some space in my head to be engaging, as it were, with someone who wasn't either me or my immediate, the immediate work I had to do, it was just a very, I think the word I'm thinking here is, it was a kind of liberation in some ways from the work we all do every day as academics, and just entering into another space that increasingly felt familiar. So I don't know if I don't think I was good enough to ever be asked, is this you or them? So Nick, you must be a fabulous translator. But that's wonderful that confusion took place for your teacher. That's great. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Jane. That was a fascinating talk, and so many wonderful ideas, insights into translating that I want to pursue. And sometimes you made me feel guilty about my own translations and what I did not and did not do. And I was not looking for a companion, but certainly there was a companion. I wanted, however, to ask you to expand about the Raphael and the city of Florence. The idea that you sort of
You're the
threw
one
out.
who should be doing that.
Well, no, the idea that you threw out about Raphael possibly replacing St. John the Baptist. What comes to my mind is that Raphael accompanies a youth. And in Florence, a youth is someone all the way up to 24 years of age. And Lorenzo becomes the leader of Florence at the age of 21, 20, at the age of 20. Yeah. So he is a giovane, very much at that time. His mother may be thinking about the kind of companion that Lorenzo needs in running Florence. And we should also not forget that the Medici were already starting to think of and use the Magi as alter egos for their own selves. And I just cannot remember the name of our colleague who wrote the big article on the Magi and the Medici back in the 1970s, but I can send you.
Syracuse.
I can't remember. It just blanked on his name. So the idea of the Magi, who are travelers from the East, also ties in very nicely, I think, with Raphael. So are the Medici trying to supplant Giovanni Battista and or to take on this idea of travelers for their own political purposes.
Yeah, oh, that's great. No, both of those thoughts are really important, Conrad. I mean, in terms of the Lorenzo reference as a youth, I mean, I think, I mean, you know, it's open as to what order Lucrezia translated in, right? I mean, we don't know, we don't have any facts about that. I'm pretty sure Tobias was the first thing she translated, for reasons I won't get into now, but it would suggest that she wrote it earlier as opposed to later with respect to Lorenzo's own, you know, initiation rite, as it were, into ruling Florence. So it's really interesting to make that connection between, you know, this may have been her first translation at a time when he also was looking for role models and help, as it were, in terms of guidance. That's a wonderful connection. I hadn't thought of it all, to be honest. You know, in terms of the Magi, again, that's also a really great way of thinking about this. I mean, in the original Medici Palace, you know, the Larga, you know, the Magi figure quite prominently, and these are works that Tornabuoni was actually probably involved in commissioning, along with Piero and Cosimo Vecchio, you know, already in the 1450s. And the Magi figure really, really prominently in those works. And so I would suspect that this predates the Tobias, you know, Raphael interest in some ways on the part of the Medici. Obviously, the Compagno was already in existence, but in terms of really laying out the Magi as the travelers, right, who get the special invitation, right, to be there for Christ's birth. You know, they have a special invitation also to kind of take this up and then to go back and tell everyone what they've seen. It's a really interesting way. And of course, the pilgrimage idea, which I played with a little bit last week and which returned a little less explicitly today, I think is also really a part of this. I mean, Raphael is also he's the saint of pilgrims. And so the idea of pilgrimage, whether you associate with Raphael or whether you associate with the Magi, you know, going to a devotional site, as it were, is, I think, an equally important way of trying to factor in the Medici as giving themselves that quasi-sacramental role, which Lucrezia totally, I don't want to say she played it up. I don't know that she took advantage of her role as kind of the prima donna of Florence, especially after Piero's death, but she was certainly addressed often as a kind of Maria. You know, definitely, you know, prayers, letters, devotional things, all kinds of things were left, you know, almost at her palace door. So thank you. Those are really great questions.
So you mentioned the rhythm and musicality transfer of works that move from one language to another, which in a poem, through a structural translation, can perhaps be accomplished under certain circumstances. Through the companionship role that you take on as a translator, is your job to faithfully replicate the rhythm you've been talking about, or perhaps sacrifice the structural aspect in favor of filling the linguistic gaps between languages? As we know, some concepts cannot be translated from one language to another.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's always a bargain or a compromise, I think, in some ways. That little passage I had that I put up of my translation of a couple of sentences of Dacia's, I think, you know, in a passage like that, I really was trying to be attentive to the rhythm. You know, again, the short, the punctuated sentence, right? But also trying to play into colloquialisms in English, which can offset a certain rhythm in Italian, as it were. And I think that's what, you know, like I said, I don't think Tornabuoni is a great poet. You know, she's not a Dante, she's not a Leopardi. I mean, there's no way we would ever confuse her for someone who had the kind of poetic sophistication that one might want. But the one passage where I cited her, you know, when we have the Raphael who's telling people, you know, I'm really Raphael, and I'm not going to cheat you guys anymore. And she had just this very colloquial expression about, you know, truth and, you know, verde. I'm not going to, you know, give you bianco per verde at this moment. I really find her, you know, she herself is not necessarily interested in being faithful to the rhythm of the Latin Vulgate. I don't think that's part of it. But I see her realizing that this bridge that she needs to create by being colloquial and by, you know, just reaching into late 15th century Florentine dialect, as it were, in ways, was her best way to make effective the rhythm, as it were, of the gospel message, or the Old Testament message. So I think, you know, again, it's always a balance. Whether Tornabuoni was thinking of it that way, I'm not sure, but it's fun to just kind of look at some of the things she introduced into her text and reflect on how kind of interesting they are and how much they make sense. Yeah, but thanks.
So I wish you could relate this to her own travels. It seems to me she went to Venice and they lived in exile for a while and then she returned. But then at the end of this translation, she talks about the search for virtue and so on as a sort of a moral. So is this moral tale related to this traveling of her own life and this where they gained all the success when they returned to Florence, and her sons then immediately became so powerful after having had so much suffering in her own travels. So was she directing this to her sons to tell them they have to find virtue, or is there simply a message to mothers of how to advise your sons?
Yeah, no, and again,
so
really
I'm
until
not clear what the conclusion is, but I love this idea of the travels
yeah,
of
no, I do
the
too.
poet like Dante
Yeah.
as a moral journey.
Yeah. No, Tornabuoni, as far as I know, Tornabuoni stayed pretty much in Florence. I mean, her main trips were to the spas or the bagni outside of Pistoia. So, her family, the Tornaquinci family, was originally the name, had been exiled, I think, a century before she was born. So she herself was, super Florentine, let's say, and that was her base, and she never had to face exile as an individual. In terms of her reaching out again to her family and her sons, and she did have two sons, until sadly one of them was murdered in a conspiracy in 1478, but which may have been after she'd already finished most of the translations. Again, it's not clear when she finished. But there is a really nice way to think about her giving them, thinking about how to reach out to children, although I'm also thinking at this point some of her grandchildren may have been the principal audience of these poems, how to take journeys, and how to be with others and how to care for others. And there's no question that the Book of Tobias is without doubt basically a set of rules about how to be charitable. I mean, the old Tobias, he loses his sight because he's been overextending himself in terms of burying the dead and spending time with the sick and giving his money to the poor. And so the extent to which that book becomes a kind of model for the charitable citizen who may suffer some hardship like Job, but who gets everything back and even more, I think becomes for her the real lesson. That's part of this. So giving endlessly, knowing you will eventually get it all back, is, I think, part of the messages that she may then be also sending to her sons and her grandkids. Yeah, so thank you.
No.
Thank you very much, Jane, again.
Sure.
So I have a question that might be a bit of a stretch, but your last quotation was really striking, because when Lucrezia writes "O Signore mio, insegnami parlare, che io sappia dir parola che si accetta," made me think of a quote that you can find in many prophecies in a bit later periods. Domenica Narducci da Paradiso, also in Florence, at the beginning of 16th century, wrote, God, please open my lips so that I can speak. So it's kind of an invocation to tell the truth. So my question is, could it be that also in this rappresentazione you can find a kind of identification of Tornabuoni with Raphael as the messenger of a truth, because he also says la verità sta verde. So he refers many times to the truth, and also but this truth is not a neutral truth. It's a truth about salvamento. So it's about spiritual salvation too. So I'm just wondering if you can find a sort of adoption of a prophetic role in a way of Tornabuoni as someone who, through her translation, is actually telling the true interpretation of a piece of the Bible, or commenting the truth.
Yeah, in a prophetic way. Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, for some reason, I think I've tended to imagine her as a somewhat modest figure in all of this, who asks for help, who recognizes she doesn't necessarily really have the talent to be doing what she's doing, but she's going to do it anyway. There are a couple of other invocations, not in Tobias, but in Esther, for example, or she says, for example, like she's already into the second canto of Esther, and she's like, God, I don't know, I no longer know the way. I really need you to kind of help me here. I'm trying to figure out what this room looked like where they were gathering, so forth and so on. So I feel like she's upfront about what she sees as her limitations. But, there are also moments like the other one I quoted at the end of Vita di San Giovanni Battista, where she basically says, I can now, it's something like, potro dar vanto, I can now put myself forward as saying that I've done something that enables the devotion of all of us to grow. And that seems, and I'm pretty sure that San Giovanni Battista was her last work. I mean, it's definitely the most original. It's where she takes the most liberty. We don't know, what do we know about San Giovanni Battista's youth? Nothing. I mean, obviously we have stories from hagiographies at this point about his time as a young boy who fled into the desert and all of this. But she goes on and on for, again, dozens of ottave about nothing that is remotely biblical. It's just coming from either other people's stories about John or her own imagination. So I think she moves into a place of greater security, let's say, or greater trust in her own word. I'd have to think really hard about the prophetic aspect of that, but I like that. And you're right. When Esther is saying what she says at this crucial moment of entering Ahasuerus' chamber, she is really in the role of a savior of her people. And Judith too utters a prayer, when she's about to cut off Holofernes' head. Help me, God, let me get this right. In Judith's case, it's not about language. It's about, an action. Esther is the more verbal figure of the two, whom clearly Tornabuoni in some ways identifies with, I think. Judith is hard to identify with. But Esther, who's bold enough to speak the words that need to be spoken, I think is a kind of model for Tornabuoni. So to think about the prophetic aspect of that is really interesting. And I will give that some thought. Thanks, Lorenzo.
If we can jump into your conversation, when listening to her and to the connection with prophecy, of course, I look at this from the side of medieval thought and late medieval one. No? So according to theories of prophecy is not just the prophecy about the future, but it's also, first of all, the capacity to recognize the signs. So to recognize the way in which history actually reenacts a previous history, which somehow circles back to the question of the potential connection with the Medici family, because it's true that she didn't went into exile, but there was this foundational figure of an exile, the history of Cosimo il Vecchio that is very present in the self-mythography of the Medici family. So I was wondering up to which point the fact of translating a biblical history into Florentine can be considered somehow a prophetic action in the sense that it helps seeing how the present history or the recent one of the family is reenacting a topical situation such as the one of Tobias.
No, absolutely. And I quoted Bridget of Sweden very briefly. I think Bridget, who is still far too, she needs to be better known. I mean, as I said last week, I think of the Trecento as having quattro corone, with Catherine of Siena being the fourth, but in a way, Bridget's the fifth. Because, she spent 30 years in Italy, and, she had an incredible impact on Italian culture when she was based in Rome for 30 years. And I think that she really, to go back to the point about prophecy, as not only being about the future, but about reading the signs that are now here in the historical moment, that's really what Bridget was all about, I think. As an aristocrat herself, not unlike Tornabuoni, as coming from a position of incredible power in Sweden, and then leaving that to come to Rome. She was all about reading the political moment in terms of biblical context and vice versa. And I think, we don't want to, as much as I like to think, Tornabuoni just throws herself into these biblical texts per se. You're right. We can't forget the context in which she's writing. I mean, these were not, they were relatively calm years for the Medici, but not always calm years. And again, she lost her own son, in the conspiracy. So I think that, that's I think the fusion of the political moment and bringing the prophetic in to kind of comment on that and place the Medici in that moment is really key.
What do we know about the Sacra Rappresentazione? Like, do we know anything?
This particular one?
Yeah.
I mean, my knowledge mainly comes from Newbegin's, Nadia Newbegin's translation and her commentary on it. We know mainly that it came out in this incredible volume of 2 volumes of these plays that were published by the Moscomini Press in 1483.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the first such anthologies of plays, anywhere in Italy, which is really quite amazing. It's not clear, who performed each of these plays, but it was clear that many of them were performed. And I think, I'm trying to remember, I think there's 14 plays in these 2 anthologies. This particular one, again, has been sometimes ascribed to Bernardo Pucci, to Antonia's husband. But I find Newbegin's kind of, just her lexical analysis, really quite convincing. She thinks it might have been an early play of Antonia's, and that it really could have had something to do with Tornabuoni herself. So even that end, as I was suggesting, where we hear about the Guardia Compagnia, that is Raphael, I really do think that's a moment where they're placing quite deliberately this play in a very Medician context.
Mm-hmm.
These new Medici, i.e. the new Raphaels, are right here as our Guardia in Florence.
Wonderful. Other questions? That's true, right?
Come back well.
Indeed, there is a connection
Back
even
well,
in the
I like
name.
that. That's fantastic.
Anyway,
Yes.
I think we have a small reception downstairs, so please join us. We can continue the conversation at the 2nd floor. And just remind us, this is not a goodbye, perhaps a farewell, but just for a little bit, because Jane will be back here in Toronto again in between the end of February and the 1st of March for another couple of lectures.
Yes, thank you so much again
Jane.
for joining us today.